Hi everyone, delonewolf here and welcome back to EVE Talk, your weekly look at the market in EVE Online. When it comes to EVE news, obviously we had another week where we could hunt the rogue drones for potentially some cool rewards. I really didn't have a lot of time to do that, so I'm still stuck at next to nothing, but I think it was definitely an okay event. The site itself was decently easy to find, not that difficult or time consuming, although challenging enough that you did want a pretty nice destroyer or a tactic that would work, or a couple of friends to help, of course. I think with more people the site all of a sudden would become quite easy. So for me, I think that this counts as a pretty good and accessible event. Next bit of news, we have the new capital gameplay where you can summon rogue drones apparently through some sort of Concord beacon that's up on the test server. So this was actually like sort of speculated, half announced by players that this is what the plan was, and it turns out that that is correct. So you have to like deploy sort of a beacon that'll summon the content for your capital ship to try and run. Could be interesting. I personally have not, I don't really fly carriers or super carriers or anything like that, and so I haven't really checked that out just yet, but I've seen a couple of feedback threads and things like that on CC, so I do believe that there is interest in that type of gameplay. Let's hope that it will be successful. And there's also, let's take a quick look next at the New Eden store. A little bit of slight controversy that comes back. I'm not sure if we'll spot it in the apparel, but there's supposed to be monocles that are back. There we go, down here. A couple of monocles, for players that have been along for a decently long time, that there was a controversy when monocles were first announced because they were, I think, just so expensive that it felt rather ridiculous. But yeah, a couple of limited time edition monocles are available on the New Eden store. And then for the ship skins, maybe I should, let's see if I can reset this to get the regular view. There we go. Still have these new skins for the Astero and Stradios. Look pretty damn good, I think, with the purple there. And other than that, we're not spotting any sales or anything like that. No, a couple of bundles front and center, but that's it. And on the services, we don't really see anything either. All right, that means that we get to move on to the market. As always, we'll start with some plex and stuff, and that's coming in at 255. If my marker wants to write, that is. There we go, finally. Alright, let's get started. You may already have seen it on the ticker, but Plex is up above the 2.8 million. So on the chart, we should see a 1-year high point. Look at that, 5-day moving average, reaching a 1-year high point, touching that 2.8 million mark. A little bit of hesitation at this point. That's also sort of normal. We are reaching the most expensive price we have seen in a whole year, and that does tend to, at some point, spook the market, but pretty wide margin between 5 and 20-day moving average. So at the moment, I would say there is still quite a bit of momentum for Plex to go even higher, and we are talking about 2.85 million pretty much for the sellers in JITA and 276 million, so that gap still very close, and those buyers at almost 2.8 million. Very expensive Plex at the moment. Trade still massively dominated by JITA, of course, because of the better taxes there. You still have like one trader apparently that is trying in the Tranquility trading tower for some reason. But this is a pretty massive increase in the price, and a 1-year high point. If you've been a Plex speculator and you managed to buy, let's say, below 2.5 million, especially close to 2.2 million, this does look like a good time to take some profits off the table. Then we get the multiple pilot train certificate, really unable to weather that storm, but not at a 1-year high point just yet. You can see about a year ago we went above the 1.4 billion ISK even for the 5-day moving average, but we're getting pretty close though. Sellers are at pretty much 1.4 billion, buyers 1.325 billion, so also a decently narrow gap. Supply is the problem here. There's not that much available when it comes to these training certificates. It's definitely a more niche item, since you can just do what you have to do with Plex as well, and you can buy this by plex in much smaller increments. Then we have the skill extractors that of course follow the plex chart very closely. Daily moving average hesitating here as well, but 5-day moving average on a 1-year high point, although we have had apparently a couple of days with higher daily averages before. We're talking 323.24 million ISK for the sellers, 315 for the buyers. Again, I would say that this is another sign of pretty strong demand for all of these items at the moment, as this is a very narrow margin for a good that costs around 300 million ISK. So another expensive one, and another one if here in April at the bottom you bought, let's say, below 280 million, which was definitely possible, you're looking at a possibility for you to take some profits off the table. The impact on these skill injectors, that should go up in price, but no, another slight counter move, more hesitation in the large skill injector market, where we have a small pullback. As we reached 680 million, the market said that's enough, we're not going any higher. Sellers have been forced down to 660 million, buyers at 636. That's definitely interesting, showing that it is its own independent market, and that it doesn't just depend on plex, but the demand for skill points definitely plays a major role in the skill injector market as well. It must be said that we went up from below 630 to that 680 million in a pretty short amount of time. Was probably a little bit too much too quickly as well for the market, and one of the reasons why we had this sharp hesitation and then a slight pullback, where at the moment basically 5-day and 20-day moving average are reaching each other, and so we could be starting to move sideways from here, I think. The small skill injector market does the same thing, meeting at around 140 million here on the chart, but that's bound to be 135. We saw that this seems to be in error, basically one step too low for all of these prices. We're talking 135 million for the sellers and 129 million for the buyers. Pretty narrow margin. I think here indeed we again went up a little bit too quickly, and that at the moment we're recovering. The market is taking a breath, finding its range, and for these small skill injectors it's pretty obvious. 130 for the buyers, 135 for the sellers. That's where the price is meeting, and from here of course we could still go in any direction. If plex continues to go up like this, I do think that a pull up, that increased prices are still possible for these injectors as well. Then we have the daily alpha injectors that pull back a little bit as well after reaching close to a 1-year high point. I think here alpha clone interest is still pretty strong. CCP launched EVE Online on the Epic Store. There's quite a bit of focus on the new player experience. I also think that they did like a campaign with some streamers and things like that. So overall, we're still above 45 million ISK on the chart. We're talking 47 for the sellers and 43 million for the buyers, showing decently strong demand here as well. 40 to 45 was the range for even through the summer, which was still pretty good performance, I would say, for these daily alpha injectors. But we're obviously in a higher turnover and a higher demand situation at the moment, where people are willing to pay 5-10 million extra for these daily alpha injectors, showing a bit more competition for it. Then we've got the hypercores that are also continuing to stay quite high. I would say 292,000 to 280,000. That's a narrow margin for the hypercores as well, and definitely at the high end of its trade range. Not yet a 1-year high point. We went up to 310 last year, but overall pretty expensive, and another sign to me personally that there is increased activity in EVE Online after the summer break. Let's move on to the minerals next, coming in at 915. Alright, that's better. It wrote this time. Let's start as always with titanium, and you may already have seen that on the ticker as well. The chart, it's not very visible, but you can clearly see 5-day moving average back down below the 4.5 ISK range, and so we're back in a slightly oversupplied situation where titanium is in a cheap phase. So if we go for JITA itself, 438, 439 for the sellers, 430 for the buyers. Really narrow margin, of course, that's next to nothing, but we get a billion units here, half a billion units there. That's just a little bit of that, all of that supply that has squashed that 4.5 and above, and the reason why at the moment I think supplies will slow down, not that many people are looking forward to selling titanium below 4.5, but this is an ebb and flow that we've been seeing going on since June basically, where we spend some time above 4.5, that draws in supply, people want to sell at that price, pushing the price back below 4.5, people start to hesitate, hold off a little bit, and then we slowly creep back up and we continue that cycle. That does seem to be the dynamic that has taken over the high-sec minerals. Here is pyrite as well, went down to a lower range as well in the last week, but you can see here at the tail end we're starting to creep back up for pyrite. 1730 for the sellers, 1612 for the buyers, and there's still decent supply here though, but slowly I think we will start to push the price back up a little bit, and it's that ebb and flow within a pretty steady range that's just been the case. Next up here we got Mixelon, looks very stable on the chart as well, with a bit of pressure at the tail end. We're talking 58.59 for the sellers, 56.52 for the buyers. So perhaps this is the first time I would say in these last couple of months that we are seeing all of them being uniformly pushed down a little bit. So all of them have the same problem, you could say, of slight oversupply, which could be a consequence of just more activity, right? If you get more newer players, people trying to game the game for the first time, one of the first things that people do try to do, because it is quite comfortable, very steady, it is to go and mine. And of course the first place to mine would be high sec, and as we get perhaps a little bit of extra supply that is at the moment pushing prices to the lower end, and we may be here for a little bit longer as new players stick around, maybe get into better mining ships, create even more supply, which, well, overall I would say would be welcome, because industry is very expensive at the moment. Cheaper minerals would not be a bad thing for the industrialists. So that's the situation there. Could also be maybe, you know, thinking about it, a little bit of like extra mining effort being done now, as people want to be ready, have goods available for the planned changes to mining ships. We really don't know what CCP is planning to do there, and if you want to be ready for nerfs, then mining a lot of stuff at the moment would make a lot of sense. Next up, we move to low sec. Here is the Isogen chart that has flattened out quite nicely over the last week at the current price of 64, which is the highest plateau we've basically seen for the entire year. 64 for the sellers, 63.5 for those buyers. The bad news: 100 million, 50 million units. Yeah, it's still that same dynamic that is playing. People have those stocks of Isogen available and are trying to sell them at the best price, but there is still competition. But you can also see, in my opinion here, that demand is starting to creep in, right? With more activity, more industrial needs, there is a bit more demand for Isogen as well, and so they're getting more aggressive with the price. 63, 63.5 to 64 for the sellers. That is definitely pushing it, and potentially, you know, I do see us chew through these reserves in the next couple of months, just in time for Q4 and the end of scarcity, which should mean that we could continue at this trend where you can very clearly see, all right, we settled above 60 for a little bit, then here we have a step a little bit below 60 at 61, and now we have another steady step at 64 as these sellers slowly have less and less of that extra Isogen, of those millions of Isogen available, and they of course want to sell at the best possible price, which will go up as interest keeps either steady or increases, but fresh supplies are hard to come by. Then we've got the Noxium chart that's going down a little bit. To me, another sign that I am correct on Isogen. Noxium is already in the active supply demand situation and price range, which all of a sudden makes it the most expensive Tech 1 mineral. And just like titanium, Mixelon and pyrite, we're seeing a little bit of pressure, probably on just more activity. If you're seeing all of your high-sec minerals drop down in price, I do do think that that incentivizes part of the mining player base to, well, risk an incursion into low sec, get one of your cheap mining ships out there, try to grab some Noxium, create some extra supply, and so you can see that we're moving towards the lower range of the 1000 to 1250 trade range. It is 1100 almost for the sellers, 1055 for the buyers, so very strong competition again, super narrow margin between sellers and buyers, and this is this feels to me normal in a situation where activity has increased a little bit. Should it create more supplies that push the prices down a bit. Then for nullsec, let's see if that sort of confirms it. And all right, I'm actually a little bit surprised at how consistent this is, but we can see on this sideline chart that there is some pressure as well on the price going lower, pushing down the 5-day moving average well below the 20-day moving average all of a sudden. And we are talking 830 ISK for the sellers, 779 for the buyers, which again to me is explained decently easily on just more activity, maybe more stability in nullsec as well, of course, as all of the different groups settle down in their regions and start to build back up. And then the question is, will we catch up in industry where eventually that could drive demand back up? Then of course trying to buy at the cheapest price or hoarding your minerals can become the best tactic as well. Then we get Megasite confirming that trend as well. I'm surprised how uniform across the board this is. 564 for the sellers, 550 for the buyers. Definitely a bit of a pullback in price here as well, showing, well, either enough supplies, and I'm not seeing this as there's even less demand for Megasite. I personally think more activity, more miners, and thus more supplies are pushing the prices down at the moment. And then finally, we've got the Morphite chart that is very suddenly steadying itself at around 63,000 ISK. So this is basically a CCP change that has been absorbed. And well, I was kind of warning you guys on this, right? Not to speculate too much on higher Morphite prices as we were in the 75 to 100,000 range, especially close to 100,000. If there was one, place where CCP was bound to increase availability, it would be Morphite, because historically speaking this is like a 10x price range to what it normally is. And so here we see that basically very first step with an immediate market reaction, pulling back to 65,000 for the sellers, 62,000 for the buyers. And of course from here you have to do a little bit of mind reading, try to do a bit of mind reading in what the CCP might do next. Will they say, well, Morphite Tech 2, let's keep it expensive and let's keep it at this range? Or do you expect, as part of the end of scarcity, that there will still be more Morphite sources potentially being introduced into the game? That's very difficult to say. We really don't know what CCP is planning to do. My personal expectation is that it will be a dynamic system, so something that you can basically run out of, and I will then potentially migrate slowly through different parts of the game. But I couldn't tell you where I'm expecting more availability to be when it comes to the resources. Morphite, yeah, it could be, but honestly, CCP just immediately first thing they did was moving on Ice and Morphite, and so maybe they're like, all right, that's enough, let's go to a completely different route for our dynamic system. But all of that, of course, is pure speculation on my part. Let's move on though to PI. That could be interesting. You may have seen my tweet on that. I was selling coolants for 12,500 ISK in a MAR, something we haven't seen in a couple of years at this point, I think. PI coming in at 1835. Today's forecast. So let's see what's happening here, and we start with the broadcast nodes that pull back just a little bit, but the chart definitely stays above 175 million, 185 for the sellers, 165 for the buyers. I would say still quite expensive, pretty strong demand showing, in my opinion, a bit of confirmation to my story that it's more supplies in minerals that are causing the problems, and not a further decline in industrial output or activity from that end, from demand, because demand is quite strong in the advanced PI materials. Then we've got construction blocks that are doing a bit of a bounce off of 7,000 ISK, but nothing too major. 7,700 for the sellers, 7,000 for the buyers. Still a pretty big margin and still more supply than demand, although not by that much. So a full turnover is not here just yet, but at least we're away from the bottom prices, which could just mean that that increased activity is finding that increased demand first and foremost into PI, which to me also makes sense, because what's the easiest activity in EVE Online to maintain, even though you're taking a summer break? It is PI, of course. It's something that you can even set for a week, for I think up to 2 weeks or 3 weeks even. You can set your extractors, just have your planners do their stuff, and you're creating PI into the game, so that tends to just have way more steady supplies even in downturns, unlike for instance minerals. And as a result, now increased activity is actually driving up demand a little bit, giving us slightly better prices, although consumer electronics still stuck at 6,000 discs, 6.1 for the sellers, 5.9 for the buyers. That's a very cheap price for consumer electronics. But let's see what coolants is doing then. Yeah, tied to fuels, definitely a different story all of a sudden. Coolants breaking out above 10,000 discs in JITA. 1 year high point has been reached here, 10,500 for the sellers, 9.8 for the buyers. So very strong demand all of a sudden for these coolants, an incredible sell opportunity. This is actually back to a normal price range for coolants from my historical perspective, from before all of the resource bonanza period. I was always very happy to sell my coolants above 10k, so this is a great opportunity. If like me you've stuck to building mostly fuel related PI materials, this may turn out to be a very good choice, because consumer electronics still 40% below that, construction blocks 30% below that, coolants are at their price and a great price to sell. Cryoprotectant solutions did a little bit of a bump. I mentioned it, that potentially this was a little bit of speculation on an implant set coming out. I think that makes sense. We were below 100,000 discs, so stepping in at this point made a lot of sense. And the truth is, we don't really know what's coming with Gateway or with Q4 just yet. And so gambling on an implant set or something like that being part of the roadmap there does make sense to me. But you can't maintain that forever. Supplies are a thing, and so we are starting to go back down, potentially perhaps creating a second buy opportunity, although I would say not yet. 108,000 for the sellers, 98,000 for the buyers. You're already trying to buy below 100k, which you could do if you really have missed that boat. But let's be honest, throughout the entire summer I mentioned this opportunity. If you wanted to load up on cryoprotectant solutions, and you could have probably bought close to 90k throughout most of the summer, you should have definitely done so by now. Enriched uranium tied to fuels, alright, plateauing at about 9,000 ISK, which is still not a full recovery, but definitely a little bit better than that 30-40% loss for non-fuel related PI materials, and stronger demand as well, with a margin of only 200 ISK, 9.2 for the sellers, 9,000 ISK for the buyers. That is pretty narrow for a PI material, showing the potential for this to go back up does exist as well. Integrity response drones are continuing like a slow upwards trend, or definitely at the high end of the range. Almost 1.9 million, excuse me, for the sellers, almost 1.7 million for the buyers, showing strong demand in these advanced PI materials. Mechanical parts tied to fuels, look at that, making their way back to 8,000 disc as well. I would say 20% below its normal price, 8,250 for the sellers, 7,450 for the buyers, but definitely a nice recovery, and this is something that I'm making as well, so very good news. Potentially we're looking at some more sales as well. Then nanites tied to implants, so also another one where again right here early September you reach a 1 year low point below 4.5 thousand disc, you get the volumes. So I would say again, speculators making a move, hoping for an implant set, but since it's not there yet, we did just create a second opportunity below 4.5, with more buying coming in as well, bringing us at 5,170 for the sellers and 4,500 for the buyers. Still very, very cheap. If it's not fuel, it does seem to lack demand for anything smaller than advanced PI. Nano factories had a bit of a pullback, but you can see that right away volumes come back to take advantage of that, and we're pushing back towards 1 million. We're almost at 1 million for the sellers, 824,000 for the buyers. Organic mortar applicators trying to stay above 800,000. Again, the volumes though, whenever there is potentially a good buy, there's someone ready to snag it up. 800k for the sellers, 757 for the buyers. That's pretty narrow margin. Recursive computing module, that one data point is going to mess with us for quite a little bit, but again showing that strong demand with a nice purchase volume and the price continuously pulling up way above 1 million ISK. 1.2, almost 1.3 million now for the sellers, and 1.1 million for the buyers. Definitely a showcase of much stronger demand. Robotics tied to fuels, finally, I mean this is still not good, but finally showing a first sign of recovery as well, getting back above 60,000 ISK. 63.5 for the first seller, 65,000 for most, and then 57,000 for the buyers. This is still not good though. Let's keep in mind, right? I kept mentioning the historical average prices that I've experienced for these PI materials. Robotics used to be 100,000 discs, so this is definitely still a very depressed PI material, despite what we're seeing in coolants, what we're seeing in mechanical parts. Then we get the self-harmonizing power cores, also knew a little bit of a pullback, but is already making its way back up towards 175 million. A couple at 1.6, 1.7 coming into play very quickly, and we can even see almost 2 million ISK on the seller page, 155 for the buyers as well. So I'm seeing decent upwards pressure on this one as well, at least a very strong demand. Sterile conduits kind of confirming that as well. Look at that volume right here. And this despite the fact that the price was basically stuck at a pretty high range. 1.2 million for the sellers, 115 for the first buyers. Definitely expensive here as well. Yukomi superconductors, a little bit of a dip here as well. This spike indicates that this is tied to implants as well. So maybe some earlier speculators coming in on this one, but we're landing at 70k, buyers below that. If you really want to, you can still buy some decently cheap Yukomi superconductors, trying to grab them close to 70,000 ISK. And finally, the wetware mainframes that have a little bit of bouncing, but again, strong volumes, and sellers back at 1.7 million, 1.6 for the buyers. And yeah, anything that becomes available that's relatively cheap gets snagged up very, very quickly at the moment. So that's the story in PI. Very impressive move here for coolants. Definitely a standout as one of the first refined PI materials that basically, from my perspective, just made a full recovery somehow. Probably not that maintainable, right? I do expect us to pull back decently quickly on all of the supplies like mine. I mean, I've got probably hundreds of thousands of units ready to sell, but it is impressive to see, and it shows that some increases in demand, in usage, are definitely happening, confirming, in my opinion, increased activity. Then we've got advanced moon materials, 2740. Let's take a look at these. As always, we'll start with the carbides, with crystalline carbonites, definitely leaving the volatile period of post-industry changes behind, but landing, I think, at a premium price, starting the year at 150, ending the year above 175, 182 for the sellers, 171 for the buyers. So definitely expensive, but I'm kind of reading this chart as we are getting away from that super volatile period. Then we've got for the Caldari titanium carbide, kind of confirming that same thing, right? In April, massive peak up to 350, volatility, but slowly declining, and then we're landing on the 200 ISK range, where we started the year at 150, 200 for the sellers, 190 for the buyers, exactly that. And you can see now how the range for the prices has diminished quite substantially, increasing stability. Then we get Fernite carbide, one big spike. This is a little bit different, tied to Minmatar, probably the least popular ship type, but with the Imperium definitely, at least for a long time, flying the heavy assault cruiser, I believe it is. So that created like a war spike, a late war spike up to 300 ISK. But again, we're definitely declining in volatility, but paying a premium by staying at around the 175 range. 166 now for the sellers, 157 for the buyers. A bit of pressure on a lack of demand and quite a bit of supply. But personally, I do think that we're looking at a sustained premium. And finally, the tungsten carbide that kind of does the same thing. Here a bit above 150 and here just a bit below 200. It's 183 to 190 almost for the sellers and 180 for the first buyer. So that's kind of the story for these carbides, right? If you'd speculated on that right before the announcement, where they were at 1 year low points. Before the industry announcement, you were making a lot of bank right here throughout up until the summer, you could say. But after that, it's pretty obvious that we were stabilizing and that we have found our new range. And so we're way more stable, but at a premium. Then we've got the meta materials with, where is the Galente one? Photonic meta materials that just recovered from a spike and is back at a 12,500 ISK. Range 12.8 for the sellers, 12.2 for the buyers. That's right on the money. And very different story here. We get a little bit of an increased price in April, May after the industry changes, but overall really one of the most stable raw materials, although it is an advanced material, but still needed materials in industry that we've seen throughout this entire period. It is tied to Take 2, so no immediate impact from the industry change that focused on Take 1, but still we had the war, we had the resource crunch. All of that did create very big waves across almost all types of materials, and this one, despite this one spike right here at the tail end, was super stable in that 12,500 range. Then we've got the Caldari one, non-linear metamaterials. Right here we do have a March spike. I think that was before the actual introduction in April, but probably a bit of speculation on the announcement of industry changes. But right then after that, right, for non-linear metamaterials, 20k and above seems to be the range, or sometimes even a little bit below that. And we are right back, a slightly expensive period again before the summer, but easily, in my opinion, pretty stable. 21,000 for the sellers, 19,000 for the buyers, again right on the money for that 20k average. Then we've got the Minmatar one, which is plasmonic. Again, yeah, pretty much the same thing. One April spike, February spike here, but overall 15 to 20k. That's where we're moving, and we're back well within that range. 18,000 for the sellers, 16,000 for the buyers. That is again pretty much where we want to be. And then terahertz metamaterials for Amar, very same thing. A bit of a low point right here in December. An April spike again on industry, all of that good stuff, but very easily absorbed, and then we're right back within that range, and we're landing in the middle, in my opinion, 17k to 16k for the buyers. So these have really been very stable, and I think that they have actually helped Take 2 stay in check. Then the other advanced materials, that was not such good news. Overall clear declines over the last year. Probably on a bit of lack of demand, I would say, a little bit like what PI has been suffering from, but here a bit of recovery at least in September, but pressure mounting again. Are we back below 60,000 for the sellers? Yep, 59 for the sellers, 55 for the buyers. So you can see that we pulled away from that 1 year low point at the end of the summer, but pressure is mounting already. Ferrogel, same story, bottom prices below 30k up to late September, bit of a pickup, but then we are starting to see the pressure again at 35,000 for the sellers, 31 for the buyers. That is starting to pull back already. Fullerenes tried to crawl up a little bit, never went above 750, so that was basically unsuccessful, and we're already down below 740 now for the sellers. Buyers below 700, they want to push that price back down. Hypersynaptic fibers, again a little bit of a pull up from a bottom range, so that's just not looking too good, although pretty much the same story. that I'm gonna say with the minerals and with Morphite, we don't know where CCP will make a move, right? And in my opinion, it potentially it could have an impact on advanced materials. All of these feel pretty low, although let's keep in mind it's supposed to be an end to scarcity, so looking for investment opportunities in the advanced materials that are all depressed may not be the best thing to do, but I'll just give you guys that thought here. When we went, for instance, for the carbides, if you had bought at these low points here in December, January, and then all of a sudden you get an announcement that impacts it, yeah, you do get some sell opportunities where you can make almost double your money. So fullerenes, yeah, not doing much. Hypersynaptic fibers not doing much. Nano transistors, right, went back above 4,000 disk for a little bit in September, right, potentially increased activity, but to no avail. Sellers 4,100 almost, buyers 3,700, opening up that gap again, and the pressure is mounting. Phenolic composites, again a little bit of a bump right after a low point at the end of the summer, but already pressure back. Pressurized oxidize, well, we can go over these two a little bit more quickly. These new items will need a little bit more time for these charts to become one-year charts, as these have been introduced with the industry changes in April. At the moment they seem to be quite stable. Ceramic fibers finally also basically moving back down to a lower range, 360 for the sellers, 338 for the buyers. So a bit of a September increase all of a sudden, but very easily and quickly absorbed by the market, and the pressure is back on for all of these other advanced moon materials. Let's see what the impact is on Tech2 ships, and that's coming in at 35.30. There we go. Let's start as always with the Basilisk, a couple of Caldari ships that, well, unfortunately I've been also telling you guys that story, I think since like August or something like that, that at the moment yeah, we're seeing way less volatility in the Tech2 ship market, and so I'm basically just bargain hunting, hoping for more volatile periods to come later in the year. And so right now the Basilisk, for instance, that's not a chart where you want to move in. When you're seeing this as touching the 200 million, that's when you can try to buy a little bit. But at the moment sellers are at 214, buyers are at 202 million. Yeah, that's just, you know, way too much competition, way too much in the middle. I'd need to be able to buy well below 200 million before I try to consider it a buy opportunity, a nice bargain, and that's just not in the books at the moment. Cerberus, a little bit of pressure, that could be good news, but also you can clearly see that the volatility is has basically left this market as well. 216 for the sellers, 206 for the buyers. Honestly, I'd want to buy below 200 million. That's a surprisingly low margin again, only 10 million on something that costs more than 200 million. That's really narrow, so way too much competition again. Nope, that's still a no for me to jump in on the Cerberus, despite the fact that it's relatively cheap. Then we've got the Guardian, that's actually moving up a little bit, but yeah, compared to what we're seeing here, for instance, in April, in June, when it comes to volatility at the start of the chart last year, that's where you can do trades. Buy below 180, sell at 230, buy well below 180, sell again 200 plus, 280, 230, excuse me, a little bit later. All of this is what we want to see for Tech2 trading. At the moment, it's just not in the books. This is how much we can move over the course of just a couple of weeks. That's nothing, that's not tradable. 190 million for the sellers, still buying below 180 million ISK. So yeah, if you absolutely have to get rid of some ISK and you want to pour it into something, maybe a Guardian is still a bargain, but you'll have a hard time on these increasing prices to snag one for less than 180. Then we've got the Hound that had a little bit of a pullback, so I think I mentioned that last week. You can definitely try to grab one on the cheap, probably close to 22 million or something like that, but it doesn't last very long. We're back up to 26 for the sellers, 23 for the buyers, and these opportunities get spotted. And unfortunately, if you can't move or expect that volatility. That also means that a lot of traders, I think, are in stockpiling mode, and thus the opportunities don't last very long. Ikitursa, quick look at Triglavian Tech 2 production. Yeah, slight uptick, but definitely stable at, well, away from those super expensive prices. 640 million for the sellers, 620 for the buyers. It's still expensive though for a Tech 2 cruiser, but it is Triglavian, of course. Then we get the Ishtar. That starts to look a little bit more interesting. Look at that pullback, well below 200 million all of a sudden on the chart. We're talking 196 million for the sellers, 193 for the buyers. Not as much margin as what I would have liked, but honestly, considering all the other charts, this one does look pretty juicy. You can definitely buy an Ishtar well below 200 million ISK at the moment, and that's not bad if you look at the full 1 year chart. But again, with that same warning, don't expect us to start to do this next, right? To have another 2 weeks and then to go from 200 to 250 to 60 million. That's probably not what's gonna happen. I think we'll just slowly stabilize, maybe push back above 200, start to move within that range, but I don't see this as something that I'll be able to trade in a week or in 2 weeks or even in a month. These would really be longer term investments trying to buy on the cheap. An Ishtar below 200 million, honestly, that's not that bad. Then we get to Manticore, unfortunately a bit of a bounce at 25 million, so never really willing to break through that. 26 for the sellers, 24.6 for the buyers. So that's another no for me. I need to be able to, see the chart break through that 25 million. Then you're like, all right, it's bargain time. But for now, we just kept bouncing and really not seeing any volatility. Then we get the Munin, stable. Yeah, this can be considered to be pretty cheap, although you can again see that the chart has hit 180, and so you can buy well below 180, and it's 195 for the sellers, 188 for the buyers. Very narrow margin again. At the low end, sure, but is this the real bargain? I don't think so. Then the Nemesis, yeah, another one that last week dropped off below 22.5 million, and look at how quickly the market spots that, fills it with demand, and unfortunately we're looking at 24 million for the sellers, 22.5 million for the buyers. So they've made their way right back up here, completely gutting that opportunity. So it was last week, 10 days ago, that you should have tried to buy a Nemesis, but again, not a lot of profit to be taken on these moves either. On Neros, very stable, but that's not where we want to buy. Buyers 176. Maybe, right, you're still buying below 180, which is good for the first half of the year, but if you look at the full 1 year chart, and this could happen if we keep steady, if Tech 2 production in all these Gnostic places does eventually mean more supplies, we could actually see us move back to these low ends as well. And yeah, I'd rather buy an on Neros below 150 than below 180 million. The Panther, alright, and if we're looking for that sign, well, this one is interesting. The Panther, a battleship requiring a lot of materials, diving below 1.25 billion on the chart. 1.24 billion for the sellers, 1.2 billion for the first buyer. So a first sign that, yeah, perhaps more supply and lower prices are in the book. And then we get our one exception. Here is the Purifier, that apparently it's either potentially it's like an off-station thing where one was traded for 50 million. Let's see what we're at here. 32 million though for the sellers and 29 almost for the buyers. That's definitely expensive. So not a buy opportunity, actually a slight sell opportunity if you manage to buy well below 25 million. And then we get the Scimitar, definitely pretty low as well, below 190. So below 190 for the sellers, 181 for the buyers. Another one that, sure, if you want to buy, you're definitely buying at the low end of the chart. I would not blame you to try that one. Let's see if the Widow confirms anything. Not really, stays just below 125 billion. 123 though for the first sellers now. Yeah, a little bit of new supply, showing that pressure. And then finally the Zealot. This is the volume spike, and this is the price response. That's what's kind of crazy. So big volume spike for the Zealot, and we're still just at 200 million for the sellers, 181 for the buyers. So all that volatility, massive breakouts, they are clearly not in the books for now. A couple of bargains to see in the Tech 2 ship market. I would say buy slow, keep enough powder. so that if we do get back into a real oversupply situation and that we're starting to see more charts like the Ishtar that are actually breaking lows we haven't seen in 10 months, that's when you potentially want to have some ISK ready to buy cheap Take 2 ships. And then the Take 3 ship market's coming next at 43.20. Let's take a look at this one and see if my story for the destroyers is finally coming true, or if I'm still not correct on this. So the Confessor was declining. All right, that's not good news for my story. So we're hoping for a increased price for the Zwepel, going towards like 45 to 50 million. Now with the Confessor going back down below 45 million, that's not good news. 45 for the sellers, 43 million for the buyers. New supply is drying up, but we have a 10 here, so overall this feels like definitely something that can stabilize at this range very easily. Then we've got the Hecate that is going down a little bit but still staying above 50 million, so this should drive a lot of the supply to it, and it does. Look at that, this is all the Hecate supplies at 52 million almost for the sellers, 50 million for the buyers, and we're seeing like over 100 of them coming in the last 24 hours. So this should mean more breathing room for the others. Unfortunately, the Confessor able to make this massive pullback back to its average range, despite what's happening here, this plateau for over a month, is not that logical to me, but alright. And then here is the Jackdaw bouncing off of the 50 million mark at 52 million for the sellers, 48 million for the buyers. Yeah, lost 2 days, you could say. That's the full page right here, so that's definitely a decent amount of supply as well. And with the Jackdaw and the Hecate above 50 million and the Confessor above 45 million, can the Zwepel do anything? It does not. So this is a real surprise to me that I did not expect, but we're still at 44 million for the sellers of the Zwepel. Demand next to non-existent at 41 million. Yeah, I'm not really sure how to explain it, except that it looks like the Zwepel is just really not popular at the moment, and that despite the fact that before this story here, you could say, it was constantly moving very well and responding with price increases a little bit after we started to see price increases and volatility in the more popular ones, because eventually that supply dries up and you do get those higher prices. And here for the last couple of months, you can see the Confessor went above 50 million, Hecate still above 50 million, Jackdaw still above 50 million. All of this has driven a decent amount of supply, of production, etc. to all of these tactical destroyers, and despite that, the link seems to be broken at the moment, with the Zwepel just, still getting, 5-6 sell orders, 20 units of them coming in here at less than 44 million. That link does seem to be broken, but who knows? I mean, we're still set for this. Hecate and Jackdaw are still very expensive, should take in a lot of supply. If the Confessor can do a bounce, then maybe the Zwepel can finally do a bounce with that as well. But for now, it's quite unusual to not see this logical response between the tactical destroyers. The link between the Zwepel and the other three does seem to be broken at the moment. Well, it's part of the story. This is what's happening. That predictability does seem to be gone a little bit, which is, well, not good news if you're looking to trade and take advantage of knowing that pattern. On the cruiser front, we're more looking at gambling if something would become extremely cheap. You may have spotted it on the ticker that the Tengu went down quite substantially. So the Legion holding quite nicely, 182 for the sellers, 175 for the buyers. That's a pretty narrow margin. Bit of pressure, but definitely no massive bargain or anything like that. Expecting the Loki to be pretty much the same. Yeah, bit of pressure, but holding above 180 as well. 189 for the sellers, 173 on average for the buyers. That starts to be on the cheaper side of 173, but it's still not like below the previous lows of the year. So it's not like a super clear jumping point. Then the Proteus was under pressure. No, actually stabilized above 180. That's actually pretty impressive as well. It's 175 though for the sellers. Is this in lot 24? Yeah, that needs to catch up. and 169 for the buyers. So we're probably going to just do a move down below the 180 chart, but overall this one feels decently stable. And then the Tengudo is seeing a little bit of pressure with sellers coming in at 179, buyers at 173. Yeah, that's below the last 10 months or so. That could potentially be a decent gamble if you manage to buy one of the really cheap Tengus, but very noticeable, all of them seeing a bit of pressure. So this may just be the beginning, just like with some of the Tech 2 ships, and potentially even lower prices, an even lower jumping point is possible. I would always just consider that a gamble and not make a move on more than one of them. And then finally, for the extra product for this week, we're going back to a classic. Let's take a look at the faction battleships 4840. Like that. And so battleships, they're big, they're faction, they were changed with the production of them was changed with the industry changes, and so I think you can like buy them as well. So all of this has changed substantially. Let's start with the pirate faction battleships with the Barghest that only just is coming down from a 1-year high point of almost 2 billion ISK. It's 1.7 billion for the sellers, 1.6 billion for the buyers. That is very, very expensive. Then we've got the Macarial that actually spiked up in April on the changes, and it looks to me like basically that one has a way steadier supply. So whoever is probably in the Nelsec region where Macarial BPCs and all of that good stuff drops and the LP drops that's needed for that is plentiful, because that one is still 750 million, 700,000 for the buyers. Compare that to the Barghest cost, that definitely looks reasonable, although it's still way more expensive than the 450 million at the start of the year. The Nestor is also above a billion ISK, super expensive, a billion and a billion for the buyers. Yeah, that's just the reality of these faction pirate battleships, unless they're being farmed to hell and back. The Nightmare almost a billion as well, although another 1-year high point that was in May, almost 1.3 billion. But it's a billion for the sellers, 960 million for the buyers. Balgorn, alright, that one a little bit, I guess, less interesting overall. Used to be one of the strongest faction hulls out there, especially in PvP, because its ability to nuke, but those modules have been changed, and so now this one is going for less than 600 million ISK, so relatively cheap. Let's see what the Rattlesnake is doing though. Yeah, that's quite expensive. In my opinion, one of the best PvE platforms, non-capital platforms in the game, and going for 900 million ISK, 870 for the buyers. Started here at 600 million ISK, and I think we bought some of these below 500 million before as well. Then we get the Vindicator that also just saw a 1-year high point at 1.3 billion ISK, going back down to the 1.3, yeah, just below that actually at the moment for the sellers, and buyers above 1.2 billion. So the story for the pirate faction ships is pretty obvious. Massively increased in price since the industry changes, and some of them are like relatively cheap, probably Macarial due to availability, and then probably Balgorn just due to the lack of popularity. Moving on to the Navy faction battleships, well, the Thunderchild starts to be something of interest to me because I'm almost done training for the Tech 2 weapon system there as well, but that's expensive. 1.1 billion for the sellers, a billion for the buyers. Definitely another one that basically went up throughout the entire year, even before the April changes, but then just keeps going up and up. This is 4 times the price we started the year at. Apocalypse Navy issue, alright, definitely a different story, completely different range. Back where we were a year ago, above 400 million, but yeah, 450 million for the sellers, 440 for the buyers. Compare that to everything else we saw here, this actually feels like a decently affordable and strong platform, so that's interesting. It's a Mar, so here is the Armageddon Navy issue, also below 500 million ISK, 470 for the sellers, 460 for the buyers. Another really strong platform that's actually affordable. Then we get the Dominic's Navy issue. That's more expensive, so here I think we'll have the the faction warfare elements come into play. Dominic's Navy issue selling for 640, buyers at 624 is basically expensive, but it's a drone ship, might have a little bit more PvE popularity as well. Megatron Navy issue though kind of confirming this, 600 million ISK as well. 620 for the sellers, 570 for the buyers. Pretty expensive compared to what we just saw for the Amar ones, so I'm expecting this to be cheap. Raven Navy issue, well, cheap, it's relative. High point was 800 million, it's still 600 for the sellers. 586 for the buyers. I would say that this is likely explained by just how good a PvE platform it is. Passive shields, missiles and drones, it's just perfect, of course. So Raven Navy issue may just have that increased popularity even more so than the Dominics. So let's see if the Scorpion Navy issue is cheap. Well, alright, at a cheap end and starting to get back up there, but at least it's 587 now for the sellers, 550 for the buyers. That's still pretty expensive, but we were below 500 million ISK in August. And then Tempest Fleet issue 600 plus, that's also expensive. And the Typhoon, another in my opinion nice PvE platform, above 600 million ISK, still relatively cheap compared to most pirate faction hulls right here. And yeah, the Amar ones are definitely standing out here with the Apocalypse Navy issue and Armageddon Navy issue as being cheap compared to everything else. And that Thunder Child, I mean, that's a 1 year chart where if you happen to have them you're looking pretty good, but that's kind of expensive at the moment. So not sure how soon I'll grab one to try some missions in. But yeah, there we go guys, these were the faction battleships, and this was Eve Talk. Thank you very much for watching and listening. As always, I'll see you next time.